Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Chris LeBlanc. He's a longtime law enforcement officer. We're going to talk about training police to function at the peak of their capabilities, but still be professionals, in their job and in their life. And I'm sure it keeps them very busy. So training is probably essential. So we'll get into that. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for coming.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about your background. In addition to being a police officer for a long time, why has it evolved into this training role, like this senior role for you?
Well, I've been on the job for almost 28 years. I spent 25 of that actually working patrol. 18 of that was spent on our SWAT team, which is a regional team. So it's a collateral duty team. It's not your primary full-time job. I spent a little time in a full-time role doing that, and then they've now gone to a different model. So it's turned full-time just because of the how much work is out there. After doing that, and now that I'm looking towards retirement, I wanted to kind of give back. I've been a trainer in one capacity or another for my entire career. Now I'm in full-time training, and I have been for the past almost 3 years.
Okay. So what are some of the additional skills that you see police are lacking or that they need, and at what point in their career and why?
I think actually from the beginning, what I would say is this: I believe that what we're doing in terms of the general American model is it's too short. The preparation is too short. You have anywhere from, 4 or 5, 6 months of training, 720 or a little bit more hours. And then you go for a 3 or 4 month FTO program, which is a field training program, where you get additional training now with another officer basically watching you. And I don't think that's enough, in particular for some of the skills that we see are lacking when it comes to the more high stress critical performance areas. We're not training enough, either at the outset and then ongoing training, sustainment training that should be occurring over time. In many agencies, there's either no training or there's only training for a few hours, even on a yearly basis.
Well, what kind of situations are the most stressful for police, and what skills do they need?
Obviously, armed individual calls, fights, things like that. But there's a spectrum there. People I don't think, realize how much room there is within that realm. It could be everything from an active shooter who's actively killing or trying to kill people in a public place. It could be a violent attack on the officer themselves. So the officer's basically facing a threat to their life or a threat to the lives of others around them as well. All the way to a subject who is armed or who might be threatening, or a threat exists, and yet the situation is not one that requires a high level use of force yet. And often tactics and de-escalation, things like that, can work in those situations. One of the problems I think we see with police and policing is the situations that should have been perhaps a violent physical arrest, but that wouldn't have ended with a shooting or wouldn't have ended in a death. But because officers are unable to control violent resistance, they turn into shootings that didn't need to happen. That's fairly rare, but we would be able to with better training, I think reduce even those.
When do problems tend to happen? Is it like at the end of a long shift or the end of a week or the end of a month, or is it just around holiday time? Like when seem to be the problem times?
It really could be any time. I've often said I work day shift for most of my career. And day shift generally is viewed as a slower shift where you take a lot of what we call cold reports. In other words, it's a report that's been pending of a non-critical call. And yet the probably most violent calls that I've been involved in have been on day shift. As you move into a mid shift or a swing shift and then a graveyard shift or an overnight shift, depending upon the agency, really busy agencies have a different kind of nature of the work, but they can tend to get much busier during those times. There can be and is a lot of violent situations that happen on those shifts as well. So it's kind of all over the place. It really depends upon, I think, an individual community. It could be very different in a rural community versus a large agency. And then frequently it also depends on what your staffing is and how many officers you have going to some of these calls.
Yeah, well, I understand. Like I'm in Austin and they defunded the police, and so you don't see them very much. And I'm sure when there is a problem, it's all resources are strained. It's just really foolish, I think. But I don't know how it is where you guys work, but what do you see has changed, let's say, over the last 5 years in how to police and how policing works where you are?
I work in Washington State, and Washington State kind of famously actually did change the law and changed laws pretty dramatically. What I've seen over the past 5 years, both being still out there working when the law changes happened, and then with COVID, we had just a complete drop-off in a lot of the things that police were doing. In Washington State, there was a lot of question as to whether we even could do some of the things that we used to be able to do because the law was prohibiting some of that. Many of those things changed back. There is a greater accountability and a greater expectation on officers now that's codified in law. And yet I think that the profession is catching up, trying to figure out, okay, where we stand with some of these laws. How do we still police? And yet how individual officers frequently concerned about how am I still able to police while still staying within the lines and then not actually risking either sanction from my department or worse, criminal sanction, which have increased. I think they pretty much increased nationwide. Washington State, they're specifically changed the law to make that scrutiny and that accountability even greater.
Yeah, I mean, how do you do your job where just from an outside observer, it seems like a thankless job? Like you can, even just doing your job normally, you get into trouble, which at least, again, from an outside observer that doesn't know. But what are your thoughts?
I think that's true. I think a lot of people feel that pressure, especially when you're out there and you're trying to do things you are trying to serve and protect. How you do your job, I would say, would be know the laws, know the rules, be very, very comfortable with them, especially surrounding use of force. And then, I tell people try not to take it personally. It's hard to do. It was much easier for me to take certain things personally or not to react to things or become reactive until I had a lot more tactical experience, a lot more training. Younger officers, it's a little harder to do because they're still sort of feeling their way. I think that the change in the law and some of that hesitation that developed from it has also led to, it's not an intentional depolicing, but I do believe there's an element of depolicing that went on during the formative years of many officers training. And now those officers are getting into 4 and 5 years on, and they are, they have a very different approach and they're not familiar with how to do old style police work.
How have you seen people change, like regular civilians, if at all, over the past 5 years?
That's an interesting question. And I think there's various answers to it. And by that, I mean this. Some people are emboldened, certainly criminals. And by that, I mean, a lot of times very lifetime criminals, career criminals, and people who are maybe doing things that maybe wouldn't be serious crimes have been emboldened because in many cases, no one was going to jail. And so there you see repeat offenders doing kind of low-level crime and a real lack of respect for law enforcement, a lack of belief that there's any accountability for some of the things they're doing, which was the case for a long time. I think you kind of see nationwide some of that's coming back now where they're like, hey, we can't just let people ride roughshod over the system. For officers and then officers in dealing with the public, you have the public, you have this group of ne'er-do-wells, for lack of a better word, and then you have people who have an agenda, whether it's politicians, whether it's people who have more of an activist mentality. Those people have become emboldened and they act far worse with police. The general public, and I think the majority of the public, is still very supportive and actually wants police to do more. Sometimes they want police to do more than the police would be able to do, even what we used to do, because I think there's a fatigue with the state of things and how things have gotten, and with the kinds of crimes and the level of crime that people see.
Yeah, like in California, I don't know how anyone could be a police officer. You know, they let people steal, was it up to like $950 worth of stuff? Like, it's just, even here in Austin, like I go to this one Walgreens and I know some of the people that work there, and some guy was stealing stuff while we were there and they just let him go. And I said, why don't you stop him? We're not allowed to. How often does this happen? They go, every day. I don't know how you can have a store and be stolen from every day and still function. It's crazy. Everything's like topsy-turvy, it seems, you know?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I do believe that. I mean, there's been a complete shift and switch. That's kind of that depolicing. You know, it's effectively depolicing, where now when you not only that, maybe you do charge somebody, maybe they steal $951 in California, say. You make an arrest, you bring that person, you book them in jail. That person's pretty much going to get booked and released. You're not even done with the paperwork. You haven't even started the paperwork yet. They're out probably stealing again. And when it makes it to a prosecutor, the prosecutor decides not to charge it anyway. And so you do get a feeling of, okay, what are we doing here? You can fall back on well, you know, I'm here for the big one, right? I'm here for that active shooter. I'm here for that real serious crime. But that's not the day-to-day of policing. I mean, those events do happen, and they will happen in most officers' careers, depending upon what kind of unit they get involved in. They may be far more common to handle that kind of thing. But for the average patrol officer, that's not a regular event. And yet you see this sort of degradation of society going on around you, and you see people commit crimes with impunity. And that's what the average everyday officer does, is they keep that stuff in check. And when you're not allowed to or not able to, because you're being undermined because the efforts that you are making at that, you're not allowed to book people, or you book them and they get released, or no charges ever get filed on them. It does wear on people for sure.
So what are some of the, again, you're training on critical skills. What are some of the skills that police need, and for what situations that you train on?
I pretty much specialize now in patrol tactics, which would be tactics of response tactics for situations that involve some sort of potential threat. The idea being de-escalate that situation through tactics and through communication with the individuals that you're dealing with, so that it does not raise to the level of a use of force, or in particular doesn't raise to the level of deadly force, if that can be managed. They can't obviously always be managed. I deal with control tactics, which is hand-to-hand controls. For a while, I've turned it over now to some other officers, but for a while, I was also our primary instructor for active threat response, which would be active shooter or other kind of active violence. My take is this, and it's a little bit different, I think, than what we see in some of the national consultant groups or others who are saying that, hey, we need to reduce the amount of firearms training. We need to reduce the amount of hand-to-hand skills and control training. We need to increase the amount of de-escalation training and that kind of thing. While the latter half of that is true, we need to increase the amount of de-escalation training. We also need to increase firearms and especially empty-hand control training. Now what you see is people get very, very focused on taser, and when the taser doesn't work, and the taser's not a 100% solution to hands-on control, they tend to default to getting much more aggressive and much more reactive, because the control skills many of them have are not are not really suited to dealing with somebody who's actively resisting. That's where you see a lot of these situations as officers are where repeatedly punching people and kneeing people on the ground. You see 4 or 5 officers trying to pin somebody to the ground and they're unable to control a person. And then they resort to punching and kicking and that kind of thing. It's because the techniques they have don't work. And I'm not at all saying that it's easy to control somebody who's on the ground. It really depends upon the person. But, I know many officers, myself included, who have spent a great deal of time and money on their own time to develop a much higher level of control skill. Most officers don't do that. Most officers get what they get at the academy, however, whatever the quality of that training is. And then after that, they train maybe once or twice a year, if that, for a few hours. You're not going to be able to control a person, especially control a person without being hyper aggressive. It's really, really difficult. When you now have sometimes lack of teamwork and lack of other things, that becomes an issue. With firearms, it's a little bit different. It's more of a case of many people now that are entering the profession have never touched a gun in their lives. And so now we're taking someone who's never touched a gun. We're taking an adult from between 25 and 45 because we have older people now getting into the profession. If they've never touched a firearm, how confident do you think they're going to be with it? How capable, competent do you think they're going to be with it, especially when they're pulling the gun and putting the gun in their hand when they're out in the public? It does not help us to reduce the amount of training that they're getting in that simply because they need to develop a level of comfort with it so that they aren't forced to overreact, forced to go to guns quickly because they're worried about whether or not they're going to be able to even hit the guy in the first place, because intuitively they know the level of training they've received is not sufficient.
Yeah, there's an old saying is people don't rise to whatever level, they fall to the level of their training. So it makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think you do see that. My agency trains a lot considering, and yet, I have a kind of a speech that I talk to all our new recruits that come in, and I tell them, hey, during this next 6 months while you're with our training unit, you go to the academy and then you come back and spend a little bit more time with the training unit. For most of you, this will be the most concentrating training you will get in your entire career. So you're done with most of your intense and serious training within the first year on the job. After that, you get, my state has a 24-hour minimum. You're required to get 24 hours of training in every year, but that training spans the gamut. That training includes a lot of PowerPoints, includes a lot of required trainings as far as different procedural things, not hands-on physical control training, stress-based scenario training, decision-making training, that kinds of thing. That's where the questionable uses of force and other things happen, is in those those serious events, which officers are undertrained for, frankly. And we're an agency that trains quite a bit.
Yeah, I guess you need like a police dojo where they do literally hands-on training, someone, being real, verbally abusive to them. How do they keep their cool? Someone, again, getting physically crazy. How do they, like you said, control the situation without, going crazy and losing it and attacking the person or shooting them? I mean, yeah, it seems like that's really important.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably the most important. What you're describing would be what I would, a more a scenario-based training. We do some of that, Academy does that. We do that after the Academy, but it frequently isn't enough so that it doesn't, there's not a lot of tension over time. You've got to retain it. You've got to retain what you did in order to apply it when you're out in the field. Now, when you're also taking, and we talked about those people that hadn't touched a firearm, getting a lot of people now that have never been in a fight in their life. They've got to manage fear. They've got to manage, okay, how do I deal with this person who's super aggressive towards me without having the confidence that comes with, okay, hey, I've been here before. We try to add that with some scenario-based training, some other more challenging training. You can't spend all your time doing that either, because you also don't want officers who think everything is a violent threat. Most things can be handled very, very capably with de-escalation, but the officer has to have confidence to start with. As someone who is not confident and is fearful is not going to regulate their emotions well. And those are all things that come with a comfort and an ability to physically handle yourself, control another person, to handle your firearms so that you don't need to. It seems sort of, it is kind of counterintuitive, but that's really the thing. The more capable you are with those physical skills, from what I've seen, the less you have to use them.
What do you, I would think that police probably go through a period where they get very skeptical or just, they feel like everyone's a bad person. If let's say, they're running into a lot of situations recently and, could it lead them to feeling like everyone's a scumbag or you got to watch everybody, that kind of thing. And they can't be a human anymore. The job changes them and just kind of like ruins them mentally.
I don't want to say ruins them mentally, but certainly the job has such an effect on people that the suicide rates are above those of the general public, and stress and a lot of other problems occur. One thing that I've been happy to see is there's definitely an increase in wellness awareness and wellness practices and things like that have really come into the agency because people are aware of toll it takes and the toll that law enforcement takes on an individual. There is an element of that us versus them. It does build up. You do get kind of calloused. You do have a different perspective on things. We need something that will counteract that. The things I tell people is have something outside of the job, a hobby or some sort of way for you to bleed off stress. That seems to be really helpful. Have friends outside of law enforcement. Unfortunately, a lot of times all the friends want to talk about is law enforcement, what you do in your law enforcement job. But again, I also think some of that comes down to, we are caught and we need to be aware of threats in the environment. And we have to beware of complacency because you can minimize threats to a point. And let's face it, most of the time, the people that you're dealing with do not have designs on attacking you. But you always have to kind of prepare for that eventuality. And that's stressful. For many people, that's stressful. That's another.
It's hypervigilance. So it'd be draining. And if that bleeds over into normal life and you can't like relax, then I can see it'll be a big problem,
Oh, absolutely. 100% it is. And it has long-term deleterious health effects for most officers. It's another, I think, thing where training can be useful where, either that level of confident competence, I call it, that you have where you are a little bit less reactive emotionally. But then also being very careful about making sure that you are doing other wellness practices and other practices that you are able to disengage from the job and it doesn't take up your entire world and your entire world view.
If an officer is off duty and they're in, I don't know, a restaurant and something illegal is happening, whatever it may be, do they have more of an obligation than a regular citizen to do something about it?
They do not. Now, whether they feel an obligation is another matter. Generally, what we teach for that is if it's not a person crime or if someone's not going to be hurt, to basically observe and report, just pay attention to what you see and what's going on. If someone could get hurt or an assault or something like that could happen, yes, you may intervene. You're not required to. You may intervene, but you need to be aware, hey, do I have all the equipment? Do I have no ability? I have no radio. I have no ability to call for cover. I don't have really that color of authority because I'm not wearing a uniform or I don't have something that immediately shows that you're the police. So you have to be very, very judicious about what you may intervene in. For the most part, the things I've seen over my career, there's been a few times that I've intervened, none of which involved having to get physical or use any force. But there's been other things where I've simply watched something and they just called it in. You will get some officers that sometimes get this sort of righteousness where they feel like they have to do something about a situation. And that's another thing that I think we need to be very, very careful about managing our emotions in those circumstances and making sure that what we're doing is not putting us in greater danger than necessarily would say if we were on the job and we had backup and a radio and all our tools, etc.
Okay. What happens, like, I don't know, what if, you're on a shift and you go to a murder scene and then like 10 minutes later you're done and now you go to like 7-Eleven for a soda and then you go home and your partner's like, oh, how was your day? Like, what do you do? How do you come down from stuff like that? Really crazy stuff,
Yeah, well, you described a regular shift. That's not unusual. That's fairly routine. So yeah, you have something like that. You come home to your partner. Some of it's going to be, your partner may be fast asleep because you're coming home at 2 a.m. And so there's no interaction. Maybe you may have a situation where your partner doesn't like to hear about the job because it makes them feel uncomfortable. I'm married to a fellow law enforcement officer, which actually has been a very, very helpful thing because we can both talk about the job and we can both decompress. We kind of have a sort of a decompression ritual. I think every individual officer, every individual family probably needs to come up with something like that, certainly to put some thought into something like that, so that they can go from being aware, being switched on, we should say, and then coming off of that. So now they can maybe they got a little bit of time where they get some alone time to sit down and do some breathing exercises. Maybe they there's a particular hobby they like to do. When they come in, they can go, hey, mom or dad just got home. It looks like it was a rough shift. So give mom or dad, or give your partner, I'm going to give them about a half an hour to an hour. And that's their decompression time. Individual families have to come up with their own ways to deal with that. Obviously, when you're dealing with multiple kids, when you're dealing with, maybe you have some tension at home with your spouse or your partner, you can see where a lot of issues for officers and stress and all that, where a lot of those things arise. And, the unfortunately statistics show there's tons of substance abuse. You have a lot of issues with relationship issues, infidelity, things like that. These are all fairly common in law enforcement. I think a lot of it is because of the stress that you deal with.
Okay. What do you do for, are police encouraged to report when they're not doing well? Can they just say to their commander, whatever, boss, it's stuff's starting to get to me. I'm afraid I might do something, not crazy, but I'm afraid I may overreact. I'm starting to feel really just burned out, or I can't take it anymore. What happens then?
Now it's much better. Certainly for most of my career, most officers wouldn't even have said anything like that because they're afraid there were stigmas. They were like, okay, people are going to feel like I can't be trusted on the job. People are going to feel like, oh, okay, am I a danger to myself or others, etc. Things have gotten much better now. The system in itself now, and again, this is probably depending upon the agency, part of the country where you work, and what the kind of prevailing law enforcement culture is, just different from region to region in the country. Now, certainly, I think on the West Coast, certainly in the Pacific Northwest, much more sensitive to that kind of thing. We talk a lot about it, even in beginning training. And we have peer support programs where you can talk to your peers for advice. If you have a critical incident, if you have something that you've been involved in, they usually put you on critical incident leave, which gives you some decompression time. You can extend that critical incident leave if you need to, and it's not considered, there won't be a negative repercussion on you if you do that. Certainly, you have to be working to get well. An agency also, hey, I can't have an officer who has been on permanent critical incident leave because they can't come back to the job. There will be repercussions there. Those repercussions would be long in coming, and it would be after counseling and all sorts of other things that would be offered. But a lot of that stuff now, they front load information, they front load resources, they front load just knowledge so that people know how some things on the job might affect them. And so when they experience that or feel that happening, they know that they have places they can go and people they can talk to.
Have you noticed that with some of the people that you work with, so-and-so seems to be showing signs that they're not doing too well? What does that look like, and what would you do right now, if that happens with an officer that's working, with you or for you, et cetera?
Oh, for sure. We definitely see that. We sadly, unfortunately, have had some suicides recently. In some cases, you could see things that, hey, things are happening and something's going on. And in others, actually, there was no sign. There was no warning. Certainly, I think probably within the family, there might have been warning signs, but, to outside observers, none. If you see something like that now, it starts with a simple conversation. Hey, how are you doing? I saw your reaction to this, or I've noticed you haven't been your old self. Talking to those people, offering peer support. Peer support is protected conversation in Washington state. So you can talk to somebody as long as you don't say you're going to hurt somebody or hurt yourself. That information is kept private. It's not going to be admissible in court. So those are mechanisms that we can use to get officers to let their guard down, for lack of a better word. And people are getting more comfortable approaching people and asking either for help or asking people, hey, do you need help? And I think that creates a better culture because people realize that there's help out there. They're not in this alone.
Okay, no, that's good. What do you see, I don't know, going forward over the next few years? Are there any big changes coming in policing, or, what needs to be done to address issues now and in the near future? What do you see?
I think some of the things that we see now that are happening are good. I'm concerned because I don't believe we're paying enough attention to the training aspects that we were talking about earlier. For many officers, for many police leaders who came up through the ranks of being officers, if it was never a big deal to you, you don't think it's a big deal, but it's kind of a big deal. It's a problem when we see some of these videos that are now going to become increasingly available, watching officers unable to control somebody who is resisting them. And you see some very embarrassing ones where you have 3 or 4 officers unable to control a single guy who's simply pulling away from them. And you see them escalate force, or they just lose control and the guy runs away. That's a problem, and we don't seem to be addressing that problem. We've seen some movements in the policing world. Jiujitsu has been has been a hot topic of conversation, but you have a lot of people for it, a lot of people against it. The tasers, the technology continues to improve. I think it will only continue to do so. And I do think that now, especially we're on something called a Taser 10, that's going to be kind of a game changer. But you still can't just rely on tools. You can't just rely on a taser. At some point, every arrest involves going hands-on with somebody, at least to put them in handcuffs. And when the fight starts then, that's when those control skills become important. I think, if anything, what I've seen is we've sort of gone back in time, and they've removed certain tools, and in some cases they're not training. They're going back to much older training modalities that are not really suited to the kinds of dynamic, very, very ambiguous environments that police work in, that require a lot of decision making, that require a lot of knowledge about applying the law in the moment, and applying skills in the moment. A lot of that training, you see certain groups talking about it. You see that I think there's an increasing amount of research in the scientific community researching how to better policing, but it's a long process for that stuff to filter down into, I think, workable solutions for officers. A lot of it's based on just resources. We don't have the personnel to have people in training all the time. And there's so many things that police do. It really isn't feasible in the way the system is built now to have officers training all the time. That's a problem. I don't know how we're going to overcome that.
Well, very good. Where can people find out more about your work? Or is it just within your department only? Or, if other law enforcement, I've listened to this podcast and they don't really have training, they feel like, can they reach out? Do you have an organization that could help bridge the gap between two different police organizations, I guess I'll call them?
Right now, no. I'm kind of I'm within my department. I'm going to be retiring soon and might be involved in some way in this space going forward. What I would point to is things like the Force Science Research Center. The research that they're doing is, I think, going to be what we're going to be able to look at and provide a foundation for evidence-based policing to make some of the things that we want to do and need to do, to base those on some kind of scientific research, because that's really where it needs to go. We need to show that, hey, look, the science says this is what we should be doing, and it's not what we're doing now. You have, I think, there's some different police groups out there, C4C, Code 4 Concepts. Chad Lyman's done a lot of great work when it comes to applying jujitsu in the policing realm, but trying to adapt it to policing and not making it so that it's just a bunch of guys doing jujitsu. That tends to be a problem in that realm. Other than that, I don't have anything right now that I'm doing individually in any sort of open enrollment or police training company. I'm really refining what I do within the agency, the people that I can most directly affect.
Well, you can have people take it over, I guess, once you retire, but is there any desire to spread it to other agencies to help them as well? Like, how could this become a national program, or is that not your aim?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that's the aim of a lot of people, and I would love to see it become that. The problem is, you see a lot within law enforcement, there's politics, and there are a lot of competing views as to how we should do this, or sometimes whether we should do this at all. The police training community is very often made up of retirees who are, padding their retirement, or they're getting a second paycheck. Many of them would be like, hey, I'm not really interested in having to relearn everything I do, or having to come up with a whole new means of teaching, because we're going to do what we've always done. And it's worked up till now. And, I would argue it hasn't worked, but when you're putting all your eggs in that basket, that's what you see, and if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always got. I don't think that's acceptable. I think you've seen some movement, certainly in the Chad Lyman's C4C, the the jiu-jitsu community, trying to apply that to law enforcement. In some places that has been accepted. In others, people have actively fought against it. They don't want to see this kind of stuff. And whatever their motivations, I don't know. But when just making some of this stuff, trying to get some of this stuff implemented, when that is being fought against, it's just a difficult prospect to try to make it any kind of national standard.
Well, very good. So again, resources for people that are listening, what would they be?
I definitely say the Force Science Research Center. It's kind of hard to say. I would check out that C4C, Code 4 Concepts. You can find all that stuff. Online for just kind of the directions we should be going. I like a lot of the things that the Police Executive Research Forum is saying, and I think they're on the mark when it comes to an overall approach. When you start getting down into specifics, I don't know that there's fully vetted training program that they're presenting just yet. And so it's more, maybe we're more in the theorizing and coming up with trying to find the right direction for all this stage. Those would be the people that I would recommend, or the resources I would recommend.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fun.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.
People, and I would love to see it become that. The problem is, you see a lot within law enforcement, there's politics, and there are a lot of competing views as to how we should do this, or sometimes whether we should do this at all. The police training community is very often made up of retirees who are padding their retirement, or they're getting a second paycheck. Many of them would be like, hey, I'm not really interested in having to relearn everything I do, or having to come up with a whole new means of teaching, because we're going to do what we've always done. And it's worked up till now. And, I would argue it hasn't worked, but when you're putting all your eggs in that basket, that's what you see, and if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always got. I don't think that's acceptable. I think you've seen some movement, certainly in the Chad Lyman's C4C, the jiu-jitsu community, trying to apply that to law enforcement. In some places that has been accepted. In others, people have actively fought against it. They don't want to see this kind of stuff. And whatever their motivations, I don't know. But when just making some of this stuff, trying to get some of this stuff implemented, when that is being fought against, it's just a difficult prospect to try to make it any kind of national standard.
Well, very good. So again, resources for people that are listening, what would they be?
I definitely say the Force Science Research Center. It's kind of hard to say. I would check out that C4C, Code 4 Concepts. You can find all that stuff. Online for just kind of the directions we should be going. I like a lot of the things that the Police Executive Research Forum is saying, and I think they're on the mark when it comes to an overall approach. When you start getting down into specifics, I don't know that there's fully vetted training program that they're presenting just yet. And so it's more, maybe we're more in the theorizing and coming up with trying to find the right direction for all this stage. Those would be the people that I would recommend, or the resources I would recommend.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fun.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. GeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Needed.